There are empires, and then there was Valyria. Long before the Targaryens brought fire and blood to Westeros, long before the free cities rose to claim fragments of a shattered world, there existed a civilization so powerful that even its ruins would be feared for centuries to come. This was the Valyrian Freehold, the greatest empire the world had ever known. And like all things touched by too much power, it was doomed from the very beginning. 102 years before Aegon's conquest, Valyria stood at the absolute height of its glory. For 5,000 years, the Dragonlords had ruled an empire that stretched across Essos like a dragon's shadow. From the smoking sea to the shores of Slava's Bay, from the northern forests to the southern coasts, Valyria's word was law. Their dragons were weapons no army could match. Their sorcery bent the very elements to their will. Their roads, built with magic and dragonfire, still stand today when the cities that connected them have long since crumbled to dust. But Valyria wasn't just an empire of conquest. It was a civilization built on wonders that the world would never see again. At the heart of the freehold rose the city of Valyria itself, a place so magnificent that even the oldest histories struggle to capture its beauty. Towers of fused black stone reached toward the sky, their construction so perfect that no mortar held them together. These weren't built by human hands alone. Dragonfire had melted the stone, and sorcery had shaped it into forms that seemed to defy nature itself. Bridges arched between towers without support, as if the very air held them up. Gardens hung in the sky, watered by channels carved through solid stone. At night, the city glowed with captured starlight, and the streets were warm even in winter from the heat that rose from deep below. Deep below. That's where the real power of Valyria lived. The 14 flames were volcanoes that ringed the Valyrian peninsula, great mountains of fire that had burned since before men first came to these lands. But the Valyrians didn't fear the flames. They mastered them. Deep in the mines beneath these volcanoes, thousands of slaves labored in heat that would kill most men within minutes. They wore protective gear crafted by Valyrian sorcery, gear that kept them alive just long enough to be useful. These slaves dug for gold and silver, but more importantly, they mined for secrets buried in the earth itself. The fireworms lived in these depths, creatures of living flame, serpents as long as ships, dwelling in lava as easily as fish swim in water. The Valyrians had learned to bind these creatures, to use them to heat their forges to temperatures no normal fire could reach. And in those forges they created wonders. Valyrian steel. Even now, centuries after the doom, a blade of Valyrian steel is worth a castle. Lighter than normal steel, sharper than any weapon has a right to be, and it never loses its edge. The secret of its making died with Valyria. Meisters have tried for generations to recreate it. All have failed. The Valyrians knew something about metal and magic that the world has forgotten, and in their forges beneath the 14 flames, they produced steel that was as much sorcery as metalwork. But steel was just the beginning. The Dragonlords ruled Valyria, and they ruled it through blood and fire. 40 families claimed the title of Dragonlord, 40 bloodlines that had learned to bond with dragons and bend these terrible beasts to their will. No one knows exactly how they did it. Some say it was sorcery in the blood, that the Valyrians had mixed their own blood with that of dragons through dark rituals too horrible to speak of. Others claim it was simply mastery, Centuries of learning passed from parent to child. Whatever the truth, the Dragon Lords could ride dragons as easily as a Westerosi knight rides a horse. And their dragons were magnificent. Not the half-wild creatures that Daenerys Targaryen would one day hatch in the Red Waste. Not the troubled beasts that the Targaryens would carefully preserve on Dragonstone. These were dragons bred for war and perfected over millennia. Some were large enough to swallow mammoths whole. Others were swift as eagles and twice as deadly. They came in every color, black as midnight, red as blood, silver as the moon, gold as the sun. Their riders wore armor forged in dragonfire, carried swords of Valyrian steel, and commanded magic that made armies break and run before the battle even began. The 40 families competed endlessly for power and prestige. They schemed against each other in the great council chambers. They formed alliances through marriage and broke them through murder. They traded slaves and gold and dragon eggs. But they never went to open war with each other, because all of them knew one simple truth. Their power came from unity. The freehold was strong because the Dragon Lords held each other in check. No single family could dominate, so all of them shared in the Empire's wealth. And what wealth it was. Valyrian ships sailed to every corner of the known world. Their trade routes brought in silk from Yi Ti, amber from the north, spices from the Jade Sea, and slaves from everywhere, especially slaves. The Valyrian freehold was built on slavery in ways that make even the current slave cities of Slavers Bay seem almost gentle by comparison. In Valyria, slaves weren't just property. They were resources to be used up and replaced. Tens of thousands died in the mines each year. Tens of thousands more were shipped in to replace them. The sorcerers of Valyria could do things that modern men dismiss as legend. They could make stone flow like water and reshape it with a gesture. They could read the future in the flames, though their prophecies were often contradictory and unclear. They could extend their own lives through dark rituals, though the price for such life was always high. They experimented constantly, pushing the boundaries of what magic could do, and they cared nothing for the cost. If an experiment required 1,000 slave lives, well, slaves were cheap. The city itself reflected this casual cruelty. In the shadow of those beautiful towers, slave markets operated day and night. In the depths below, the mines never stopped, never slowed, never showed mercy. The Valyrians had built paradise for themselves on the backs of countless others, and they felt no guilt about it at all. To them, this was simply the natural order. They were the masters. Everyone else was a resource. Their colonies spread across Essos like seeds from a great tree. Volantis was the first and greatest, a city built to guard the eastern reaches of the Empire. It grew so large and wealthy that it began to rival Valyria itself, though its people never forgot where true power lay. Lys and Tyrosh and Myr rose as outposts of Valyrian culture, each taking on its own character while remaining fundamentally Valyrian in spirit. Even as far as Westeros, the Valyrians had touched the world. The Dragon Lords, who would become the Targaryens, had settled Dragonstone as the westernmost outpost of their empire. These colonies paid tribute to Valyria, but they also grew rich themselves. They adopted Valyrian customs, spoke Valyrian dialects, and tried to imitate Valyrian sorcery, with varying degrees of success. They bought Valyrian steel when they could afford it. They traded slaves and gold and dragon eggs with the freehold. They were proud to be part of something greater than themselves, part of an empire that seemed eternal. because that's what Valyria felt like, eternal, unchanging, as permanent as the mountains themselves. The Valyrians had conquered the Rhoynar, whose water magic had once seemed unstoppable. They had broken the Giscari Empire, not once, but many times, until that ancient civilization was reduced to cities that sold slaves to their former enemies. They had explored lands as far as Sothorios and returned with treasures and horrors in equal measure. They had fought against the forces of nature itself and won. When earthquakes shook other lands, Valyrian buildings stood firm. When floods drowned other cities, Valyrian magic held back the waters. They believed themselves invincible. And why wouldn't they? For 5,000 years, they had been proven right. On the streets of Valyria in those final days, life continued as it always had. Merchants argued over the price of silk in market squares beneath floating gardens. Dragon riders practiced their formations over the bay, their beasts roaring challenges to each other that shook the windows below. Sorcerers gathered in their towers to debate the nature of magic and conduct experiments that lesser men would call blasphemy. Slaves shuffled through the streets in their chains, heading to the docks or the mines or the great houses, their eyes empty of hope. The Dragonlord families played their endless games of politics. The Valyrians hosted a feast that lasted 3 days. The Valyrians announced a new ship design that could sail faster than any vessel on the seas. The Targaryens, a minor family of middling power, quietly prepared to abandon their estates and move to Dragonstone. Though few paid attention to such a small decision by such an unimportant house. In the council chambers, the 40 families debated matters of trade and tribute. Which colony should pay more? How many dragons should be sent to put down a slave rebellion in the east? Should they expand their territory further south or consolidate what they already held? These were the concerns of empire, the daily business of ruling the world. No one was discussing what to do about the tremors. Oh, there had always been tremors. The 14 flames were volcanoes, after all. The earth shook sometimes. That was normal. That was natural. The Valyrians had lived with this for 5,000 years. Their buildings were designed to withstand it. Their magic reinforced the very ground beneath them. A few tremors meant nothing. And yet, some of the older slaves whispered about how the tremors were different now, more frequent, stronger, coming from deeper in the earth. But slaves always whispered about something. Their fears meant nothing. They understood nothing of the forces that the Valyrians controlled. Some of the dragons were restless. Their riders noticed it, but dismissed it as temperament. Dragons were never truly tame after all. A restless dragon just meant a rider needed to be more careful, more firm in their commands. Some of the priests issued warnings, but the priests always issued warnings. That was their job, to read signs and portents and prophecies in the flames. And their warnings contradicted each other anyway. One priest said the flames showed glory ahead. Another said the flames showed darkness. A third said the flames themselves were troubled. When prophecies disagree, sensible people ignore all of them and focus on the tangible world instead. This was Valyria at its height. This was the greatest empire the world had ever known. This was power and glory and magic and wealth concentrated in one place like nowhere else in history. This was a civilization that had conquered everything it touched and grown comfortable in its invincibility. This was the moment before the fall, because perfection never lasts. And something was stirring beneath the 14 flames, something that even Valyrian magic couldn't control. The slaves knew it in their bones. The dragons knew it in their blood. The earth itself knew it in its molten heart. But the Dragon Lords, they knew only their own power, and they believed that power would last forever. They were wrong. The first sign that something was truly wrong came from the mines. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that gets lost in the daily business of empire. A foreman reported that the fireworms were behaving strangely. These creatures, the great serpents of live-in flame that dwelt in the deepest parts of the earth, had always been dangerous. That was their nature. But they had also been predictable. The Valyrians had studied them for thousands of years, learned their patterns, understood their behavior well enough to work around them. Now they were moving differently. The fireworms were rising from the deepest shafts, coming up to levels where they hadn't been seen in generations. They were more aggressive, attacking slaves and overseers without the usual warning signs. And they were louder. The sound of their movement through stone, that grinding scrape of scale on rock, echoed through tunnels where it had never been heard before. The foreman brought his concerns to his master, a dragon lord of House Coheris, who owned several of the largest mines beneath the 14 flames. The dragon lord listened, nodded, and ordered more protective gear for the overseers. The slaves could make do with what they had. Losses were acceptable. They always were. As for the fireworms themselves, well, perhaps they were simply breeding. Perhaps the season affected them in ways that hadn't been documented. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. The foreman went back to his work. The slaves kept digging, and deep below, the fireworms continued to rise. 3 weeks later, a tremor struck during the afternoon. It was strong enough that people actually stopped what they were doing. In the market squares, merchants steadied their stalls. In the towers, sorcerers paused their experiments and waited for the shaking to pass. On the Dragonmont, where the great beasts made their lairs, several dragons took to the air without their riders, shrieking their displeasure at the disturbance. The tremor lasted perhaps 20 seconds. When it ended, life resumed. But this time, a few more people were paying attention. In the Temple of the 14 Flames, the priests gathered to read the signs. They stared into fires that burned in great bronze braziers, fires that had never been allowed to die since the temple's founding 2,000 years before. And what they saw troubled them deeply. The high priest, a man named Voharon, whose face was scarred from years of staring into flames too hot for mortal eyes, called for a full divination. All 12 of the senior priests would read the flames at once, comparing their visions, seeking consensus in what the fire was trying to tell them. They fasted for 3 days. They performed the old rituals, the ones that required blood and pain. They entered their trances and opened themselves to whatever truths the flames might reveal. And they came back with 12 different prophecies. One saw glory and expansion, the empire reaching new heights of power. Another saw darkness and ash, cities crumbling beneath mountains of flame. A third saw water, endless water drowning everything. A fourth saw dragons falling from the sky like burning stars. A fifth saw absolutely nothing, which frightened him more than any vision of disaster could have. The priests argued for hours. They compared their visions, trying to find common threads. But there were none, or rather, there were too many. Every priest had seen something different, and none of them could agree on what it meant. Finally, Vaharon made a decision. He would present all 12 visions to the Council of Dragon Lords and let them decide what action, if any, should be taken. It was irregular. Usually, the priests came to consensus before bringing their prophecies to the secular leaders. But these were unusual times, and unusual times called for transparency. The council listened to the prophecies with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Some of the Dragon Lords took the warnings seriously, others dismissed them entirely. One lord from House Valyrian stood and pointed out that contradictory prophecies were essentially meaningless. If the flames couldn't agree on what they were showing, then clearly there was nothing definitive to show. Another lord suggested that perhaps the priests had simply lost their skills, grown lazy in their comfortable positions, and were now imagining things that weren't there. A vote was called. Should the council take any action based on these prophecies? Should they commission studies of the 14 flames? Should they reduce mining operations until they better understood what was happening beneath the earth? The vote failed. 23 families voted against any action. 15 voted in favor. 2 abstained. The empire would continue as it always had. The mines would keep operating. The dragons would keep flying. The sorcerers would keep experimenting. And the priests would keep watching the flames, seeing things that no one in power wanted to hear. But the tremors didn't stop. Over the next month, they came more frequently. Small ones at first, barely noticeable, then larger ones. One night, a tremor struck while most of the city was sleeping, strong enough to crack walls in some of the older buildings. 3 slaves died when a mine shaft collapsed. A section of the great aqueduct that brought fresh water to the eastern quarters developed a leak. These were still minor problems by Valyrian standards. Walls could be repaired, slaves could be replaced, aqueducts could be fixed. But the frequency was concerning. Where tremors had once come, perhaps once a month, now they were happening every few days, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The dragons were definitely noticing. Even the most skeptical riders couldn't deny it anymore. Their beasts were harder to control, more unpredictable. Several dragons refused to fly on certain days for no apparent reason. Others became aggressive with their riders, something that rarely happened with well-bonded pairs. In the great dragon caves on the eastern slopes, handlers reported that the dragons were sleeping less, pacing more, and occasionally fighting with each other over territory that they'd shared peacefully for years. One of the greatest dragons in all of Valyria, a massive beast called Terax, who had lived for nearly 200 years, simply vanished one night. His rider, Lord Arteris of House Valyrian, organized search parties. They scoured the coasts, checked every island within 100 miles, even sent ships to the colonies asking if anyone had seen a giant black dragon flying past. Terax was never found. It was as if he had simply decided he'd had enough of Valyria and left. Or perhaps he knew something that his rider didn't. In the slave quarters, the whispers grew louder. The slaves had always talked among themselves, sharing rumors and fears and desperate hopes. But now, their talk had a different quality to it. They weren't just discussing their daily suffering anymore. They were discussing escape. Under normal circumstances, escaping from Valyria was essentially impossible. Where would a slave go? The peninsula was surrounded by water on 3 sides, and the landward routes were heavily patrolled. The Valyrians had dragons. They had magic. They had resources that no escaped slave could hope to match. Any slave who tried to run would be caught within days and made an example of in ways that ensured no one else would be stupid enough to try. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the slaves, who spent their days in the deepest parts of the earth, had noticed things that the dragon lords in their towers had missed or dismissed. The heat in the mines was increasing, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. Day by day, the deeper shafts were becoming harder to work. Even with the protective gear, slaves were collapsing from heat exhaustion more frequently. The fireworms were everywhere now, no longer just in the deepest levels, but throughout the entire system. And sometimes, late at night, when the sounds of picks and hammers had stopped, the slaves could hear something else. A deep rumbling, like the earth itself was groaning. A few slaves started disappearing, not many, a handful here and there. Under normal circumstances, runaway slaves would be hunted down immediately, but the overseers were distracted. The dragon lords were distracted. Everyone was distracted by the tremors and the dragons and the contradictory prophecies. So a few slaves managed to slip away. Some stole boats and tried to sail to the colonies. Most probably died, but a few might have made it. In the great houses, the dragon lord families continued their political games, but now there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Some families were quietly moving assets out of Valyria. Nothing obvious, nothing that would cause panic, just a gradual shifting of wealth from the homeland to the colonies. House Targaryen was the most obvious about it. They had never been one of the most powerful families. The dragons were impressive, but not legendary. Their wealth was substantial, but not overwhelming. They ranked somewhere in the middle of the 40 families, important enough to have a voice in the council, but not important enough to dominate it. And then they announced they were relocating their primary seat to Dragonstone. The official reason was strategic. Dragonstone was the westernmost outpost of the Empire, a fortress on an island at the edge of the known world. By basing themselves there, the Targaryens would be in a perfect position to monitor the unconquered lands of Westeros and perhaps, one day, launch an invasion. It made sense. It was reasonable. It was the kind of long-term strategic thinking that any ambitious family might pursue. But everyone knew the real reason. Daenerys Targaryen had dreamed. Daenerys the Dreamer, they would later call her. A young woman who had been blessed or cursed with the gift of prophecy. And she had dreamed of fire and ash and destruction. She had seen Valyria burning. She had seen the mountains exploding. She had seen dragons falling from the sky and the sea swallowing the land. She had seen the end of everything. Her father, Lord Enar Targaryen, had believed her. That alone was remarkable. Prophecies were common in Valyria, and most of them were wrong. Every family had at least one member who claimed to have prophetic dreams. But Enar had looked into his daughter's eyes and seen something that convinced him. He had seen absolute certainty. He had seen truth. So the Targaryens were leaving. They were taking their 5 dragons, their household, their portable wealth, and they were relocating to an island fortress 1,200 miles away. They were abandoning their estates, their mines, their position in the freehold. They were giving up everything they had built in Valyria for generations. The other families thought they were mad. Some mocked them openly at council meetings. Others pitied them, assuming that Enar had grown old and fearful, that he was letting his daughter's nightmares rule his judgment. A few families even tried to buy the Targaryen estates at discount prices, figuring they might as well profit from this foolishness. But a very few families looked at what the Targaryens were doing and wondered if perhaps they should be worried too. If perhaps they should take the tremors and the restless dragons and the contradictory prophecies more seriously than they had been. House Valyrian, the greatest seafaring family in all of Valyria, began moving more ships to their colonial ports. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual shift in their fleet positions. House Celtigar, who had close ties to the Targaryens, started investing more heavily in their holdings on Claw Isle. House Corheris, who owned the mines where the fireworms were acting so strangely, quietly began training their younger sons in colonial administration rather than mining operations. These were small changes, subtle changes, the kind of moves that could be explained away as normal business decisions if anyone asked. But they were changes nonetheless. And still, the official position of the freehold was that everything was fine. The tremors were normal. The dragons were just being temperamental. The prophecies meant nothing. Valyria had stood for 5,000 years. It would stand for 5,000 more. In the markets, prices started fluctuating in unusual ways. Slaves were getting more expensive because fewer ships were bringing them in. Dragon eggs, usually rare but available, became almost impossible to find as families held onto them rather than trading them. Valyrian steel swords, which had always commanded high prices, became even more valuable as some of the forges reduced their production. A merchant named Gallisaur, who had made his fortune trading between Valyria and the colonies, decided it was time to permanently relocate to Volantis. He sold his properties in Valyria at a loss, packed everything he could carry onto 3 ships, and sailed away. When his friends asked him why, he told them he couldn't explain it. He just knew, the same way a bird knows when it's time to fly south for winter. Something was wrong, and every instinct he had was telling him to leave. Dozens of other merchants made similar decisions, then hundreds. It wasn't a mass exodus. It wasn't even noticeable unless you were paying close attention. But the population of Valyria was shrinking, bit by bit, as those with means and mobility found reasons to be elsewhere. The council noticed. How could they not? But rather than taking it as a warning sign, they took it as an insult. These merchants and miner families were abandoning the freehold out of cowardice and greed. They were putting their own interests ahead of the Empire's. Some dragon lords called for laws to prevent people from leaving. Others suggested imposing heavy exit taxes. A few suggested that anyone who abandoned their properties should have those properties seized by the state. In the end, they did nothing. The families were too busy arguing with each other to come to any consensus on action. And deep down, most of them still believed that there was nothing to worry about. Valyria had survived everything the world could throw at it. It would survive this too. But late at night, when the tremors woke them from their sleep, some of the dragon lords must have wondered, must have felt, just for a moment, the first cold touch of real fear, must have understood that something was very, very wrong. The earth was trying to tell them something. The dragons were trying to tell them something. The flames were trying to tell them something. Even the slaves, who understood nothing of magic or politics, were trying to tell them something. But the dragon lords, secure in their power and their certainty, weren't listening. And by the time they finally understood what all those warnings meant, it would already be far too late. 10 days before the doom, a section of the great market collapsed. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, when the market was at its busiest. Hundreds of merchants and buyers were moving through the covered stalls, haggling over silk and spices and slaves. The market had stood for 800 years, one of the oldest structures in Valyria, its roof supported by columns of fused black stone that had been shaped by dragonfire and sorcery. One of those columns cracked. The sound was like thunder, sharp and sudden in the enclosed space. People stopped, looked up, and for just a moment everyone froze. Then the column shattered completely, and a section of roof came crashing down. 17 people died. Dozens more were injured. The damage was extensive enough that the entire eastern wing of the market had to be closed for repairs. The official explanation was age. The column had been ancient after all. 800 years of supporting that weight. It was only natural that eventually something would fail. These things happened. The structure would be reinforced and reopened within a month. But the people who had been there, the ones who survived, they knew better. They had felt the tremor that came just before the column cracked. It hadn't been age. It had been the earth itself, shaking hard enough to break stone that had stood firm for centuries. Still, life continued. Because what else could people do? This was Valyria. This was home. This was the center of the world. You didn't just abandon your life because of a few tremors and a collapsed roof. In the dragon caves, the handlers were having increasing problems. The dragons weren't sleeping properly anymore. They paced constantly, their massive bodies moving restlessly through the caverns carved into the mountainside. Some refused to eat. Others ate more than usual, as if they were preparing for something. Several of the younger dragons had started fighting with each other. Vicious battles that left scars and occasionally killed one of the combatants. Lord Balix of House Coheris, who owned more dragons than any other family except perhaps the Valyrians, called a meeting of the Master Handlers. These were men who had spent their entire lives working with dragons, who understood these creatures better than anyone in the Empire. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why his dragons, beasts he had raised from eggs, were acting like wild animals. The handlers gave him the only answer they had. The dragons were afraid. It seemed impossible. Dragons feared nothing. They were the apex predators of the world. They had no natural enemies. What could possibly frighten a creature that breathed fire and flew through the sky? But the handlers insisted. Whatever it was, whatever the dragons sensed, it had them terrified. And a terrified dragon was a dangerous dragon. Several handlers had already been injured. One had been killed when a dragon he'd worked with for 15 years suddenly turned on him without warning. Lord Balix ordered increased security measures, more handlers assigned to each dragon, stronger chains for the more aggressive beasts. He even considered having some of the younger, more unstable dragons put down. But in the end, he didn't. They were too valuable. Dragon eggs were increasingly hard to come by, and every dragon represented decades of breeding and training. You didn't destroy that kind of investment over a bit of temperamental behavior. In the Temple of the 14 Flames, the priests had stopped arguing. They had moved past contradictory prophecies into something worse. Now, when they looked into the flames, many of them saw nothing at all. the fire showed them only itself, burning, dancing, consuming. No visions, no prophecies, no glimpses of what might come. High Priest Vaharon spent an entire night staring into the sacred flames, the ones that had never gone out in 2,000 years. He performed every ritual he knew. He opened himself completely to whatever truth the fire might reveal. And he saw nothing, or perhaps, more accurately, he saw that there was nothing left to see. The future had narrowed to a single point, a single inevitable moment that the flames refused to show him. When dawn came, he went to his chambers and wrote a letter to his family in Volantis. He told them not to return to Valyria. He told them to keep his grandchildren safe. He told them he loved them. He didn't tell them why he was writing. He didn't know how to explain what he felt, the certainty that had settled in his bones like winter cold. He sent the letter with a fast ship. It would arrive in Volantis 8 days later. His family would read it, confused by its tone, but not particularly alarmed. After all, Grandfather Valyrian had always been dramatic. That was what happened when you spent your life staring into fires and reading portents. The letter would save their lives. In the mines, work had become nearly impossible in the deepest shafts. The heat was unbearable, even with protective gear. The fireworms were everywhere, forcing slaves and overseers to abandon entire sections. Some of the tunnels had started glowing, a dull red heat emanating from the walls themselves. The stone was hot enough to burn flesh if you touched it for more than a few seconds. The mine foremen reported this to their masters. The masters reported it to the council. The council debated what to do. Some families wanted to close the deep mines entirely until they understood what was happening. Others argued that this would be economic suicide. The deep mines produce most of Valyria's gold and silver. They were where the best ore was found, the materials needed for Valyrian steel. Closing them would cost millions of gold pieces in lost production. After 2 days of debate, the council reached a compromise. They would reduce operations in the deepest mines, but not close them entirely. They would pull the slaves back to safer levels and increase safety measures. They would assign sorcerers to study the phenomenon and determine its cause. It was a reasonable solution. It was a measured response. It was exactly the kind of careful, balanced decision that the Freehold had been making successfully for 5,000 years. It was also far too little, far too late. On the surface, in the city proper, strange things were happening. Small things, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The canals that wound through the lower city started steaming. Not boiling, just steaming, as if the water itself had grown warm. Fish began dying in large numbers, floating belly up in the harbours. Birds, usually so common in Valyria, started disappearing. Some mornings, the sky was empty of anything except dragons. A scholar named Tyros, who studied natural philosophy at one of the great libraries, became obsessed with documenting everything he observed. He kept detailed notes of every tremor, every strange occurrence, every unusual behavior he witnessed. He measured the temperature of the canal water daily. He counted the number of bird corpses he found. He interviewed miners and dragon handlers and sailors and anyone else who might have relevant information. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. This wasn't real scholarship. It was just cataloguing disasters and oddities. Where was the analysis? Where was the theory? But Tyros wasn't interested in theory. He was interested in survival. Because unlike most scholars who lived in their heads and their books, Tyros had a practical streak. He had grown up in a fishing village before his talents earned him a place in the city. He knew how to read weather and water and animal behavior, and everything he was seeing told him that something catastrophic was coming. He began making copies of the most important texts in the library. Not the famous books. Those would be preserved, copied in scriptoriums across the empire. No, he copied the obscure ones, technical manuals on dragon breeding, historical accounts that existed in only a single manuscript, maps of lands beyond the empire, books on metalworking and sorcery and shipbuilding, things that might be lost if something happened to Valyria. He packed these copies in waterproof cases. He stored them in a rented room near the docks. He told no one what he was doing. If he was wrong, if nothing happened, he would look like a fool. But if he was right, these books might be all that survived of Valyria's knowledge. 5 days before the doom, the Targaryens departed for Dragonstone. It wasn't a quiet exit. 5 dragons rising into the sky with their riders, followed by a flotilla of ships carrying the family's portable wealth and their most loyal retainers, made for quite a spectacle. Half the city came out to watch. Some people cheered, some jeered. Most just watched in silence, wondering if the Targaryens knew something everyone else didn't, or if they were simply cowards fleeing from shadows. Daenerys Targaryen stood on the deck of the lead ship as it pulled away from the dock. She was young, barely 20, but her face looked older. The dreams had aged her, worn her down with visions of fire and death. She didn't look back at Valyria. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, toward the horizon, toward the distant island that would become her family's new home. Her father, Lord Enar, stood beside her. He did look back. One last time, he watched the towers of Valyria recede into the distance. The city of his birth, the city of his ancestors, the greatest city in the world. He knew he would never see it again. His daughter's dreams had shown him that much. What he didn't know, what Daenerys herself had never been able to see clearly in her visions, was exactly how much time they had. Days, weeks, months. The dreams showed fire and destruction, but not when. As it turned out, they had 5 days, just barely enough. In the council chambers, the Dragon Lords held what would be their final meeting. The attendance was notably thin. Several families had representatives in the colonies, and hadn't bothered to send anyone back for this session. The Targaryens were gone. A handful of other families were mysteriously absent, but enough families were present to constitute a quorum. They went through their usual business. Trade disputes were settled, taxes were adjusted, military deployments were approved. There was a brief discussion about the mines and the heat problem, but no new decisions were made. There was a report on dragon breeding programs. There was a debate about whether to send an expedition to explore the ruins of Old Geese. It was all so normal, so routine, so completely ordinary. No one suggested that perhaps they should be focusing on the tremors that now came multiple times per day. No one proposed evacuating the population. No one stood up and said that maybe, just maybe, they should all be very worried about what was happening beneath their feet. To do so would have been to admit that the Targaryens had been right, that Daenerys the Dreamer had seen true, that the freehold, the mighty Valyrian freehold, was in danger, and that was unthinkable. The Dragon Lords had built their entire identity around being the masters of the world. To admit vulnerability was to admit weakness, and weakness was death. in the endless political games they played with each other. So they talked about trade and taxes and dragons, and they adjourned the meeting with plans to reconvene in 2 weeks. Many of them would be dead long before that date arrived. That night, the tremors came harder and more frequently than ever before. Every hour, the earth shook. Not catastrophically, not enough to bring down more buildings, but enough that no one could sleep. Enough that people huddled in their homes, jumping at every tremor, wondering if this one would be the one that finally brought everything crashing down. In the Slav quarters, the whispers had grown into open talk of rebellion. Not escape. Rebellion. If Valyria was going to fall, if the Dragon Lords were about to lose everything, then perhaps this was the moment for the slaves to rise up and take their freedom. Several groups began organizing, making plans, gathering weapons. They never got the chance to act on those plans. Events would overtake them before they could move. The dawn of the last full day broke clear and warm. The tremors had stopped some time before sunrise, and for a few precious hours the city was quiet, almost peaceful. People emerged from their homes cautiously, checking for damage, talking in hushed voices about what was happening. Some shops opened, some merchants set up their stalls in the undamaged parts of the market. A few brave souls even joked about the situation, making light of their fears. This was Valyria, after all. They had survived worse. They would survive this. Dragon riders took to the sky, their beasts moving sluggishly, reluctantly, but obeying their master's commands. From above, the city looked almost normal, beautiful even, with its black stone towers and hanging gardens and bridges spanning impossible distances. But if those riders had looked east, toward the 14 flames, they might have noticed something odd. The peaks were smoking more heavily than usual, and the smoke had a strange colour to it, not just grey, but tinged with red and orange, as if the mountains themselves were bleeding. By midday, the tremors had started again. Stronger than before. Much stronger. Strong enough that buildings actually swayed. Strong enough that people ran into the streets, afraid to be trapped inside if something collapsed. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the tremors stopped. Complete silence. Complete stillness. Not even the usual sounds of the city. The voices, the footsteps, the everyday noise of thousands of people living together. Everyone had gone quiet, waiting, listening. The earth was holding its breath. And in that silence, in that terrible stillness, anyone paying attention could have heard it. A deep rumbling, coming from somewhere far below, getting louder, getting closer. The dragons heard it. Every dragon in Valyria, bonded and wild, raised their heads and screamed. A chorus of terror that echoed across the city, a warning that came too late to save anyone. Night fell on Valyria for the last time. People went to their homes, because where else could they go? Some prayed. Some held their families close. Some got drunk, trying to drown their fears in wine. Some packed bags they would never use, preparing to flee in the morning. In his study, Scholar Tyros added one final entry to his journal. The tremors have stopped. This should be comforting. It is not. I fear the silence more than the shaking. Tomorrow, I will take my documents and go to the docks. Tomorrow, I will book passage to Volantis. Tomorrow, I will leave this city I love. If I am wrong, if nothing happens, I will spend the rest of my life being mocked for my cowardice. But I am not wrong. I can feel it. The end is coming. He closed the journal, packed it with his other documents, and tried to sleep. He didn't succeed. Few people in Valyria slept that night. Morning would bring the doom. But on that last night, in those last hours, Valyria still stood. Beautiful, powerful, proud, the greatest empire the world had ever known. Still believing, even now, that somehow it would endure. It would not. The sun rose on Valyria for the last time. It was a normal sunrise. Beautiful, even. The light caught the black stone towers and made them shine. The hanging gardens glowed with morning dew. For just a moment, as the first rays of dawn touched the city, Valyria looked exactly as it always had. Perfect, eternal, untouchable. That moment lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then the earth opened up and hell came pouring out. It started in the mines, deep in the shafts beneath the 14 flames, where slaves had been digging for gold and silver for 5,000 years, where the fireworms lived in the hottest depths, where the very walls glowed with heat. That's where the first breakthrough happened. A slave named Korlos was working in one of the upper tunnels, a relatively safe area compared to the depths below. He had survived 10 years in the mines, longer than most. He knew every sound the earth could make, every tremor and shift. He knew the difference between normal and dangerous. What he heard now was neither. It was something else entirely, a roaring, not like wind, not like fire, like the earth itself was screaming, and it was getting louder, getting closer. Coming up from below, from the deepest shafts that had been abandoned days ago when the heat became too intense. Korlos dropped his pick and ran. He didn't think, he didn't hesitate, he just ran. Behind him, he heard other slaves doing the same, heard the overseers shouting, heard the sound of chains as people desperately tried to free themselves. He made it perhaps 50 feet before the tunnel behind him exploded. A column of superheated gas and molten rock erupted from the depths, moving faster than any man could run. It consumed everything in its path. Slaves, overseers, support beams, stone walls, all of it vaporized in an instant. The temperature in the tunnel went from hot to unsurvivable in less than a second. Korlos felt the heat hit his back, felt his skin beginning to char. He opened his mouth to scream and breathed in fire. He was dead before he hit the ground. In that same instant, the same thing was happening in a dozen other mine shafts. 24, 50. All around the base of the 14 flames, the earth was splitting open, releasing pressure that had been building for weeks, for months, perhaps for years. The mountains themselves began to explode. The first to go was the westernmost flame, the smallest of the 14 volcanoes. One moment it was there, smoking as it always had. The next moment, the entire top third of the mountain simply disintegrated. Rock and lava and ash were thrown miles into the sky, a column of destruction that could be seen from anywhere in the city. The sound came a few seconds later. A boom so loud it shattered windows, so loud it knocked people off their feet, so loud it made ears bleed. In the dragon caves, the beasts went mad with terror, thrashing against their chains, screaming, trying desperately to escape. Then the second flame exploded, then the third. Then all 14 at once, a synchronized cataclysm that turned the entire eastern horizon into a wall of fire. In the city, people were running, screaming, dying. Not from the lava yet, that would come later, but from the shockwaves, from falling debris, from buildings that had stood for centuries suddenly coming apart. The great tower of House Valyrian, one of the tallest structures in Valyria, swayed like a tree in a storm. For a moment, it seemed like it might hold. Then a tremor stronger than all the others hit, and the tower's foundation cracked. The entire structure tilted, slowly at first, then faster. It came down across 3 city blocks, crushing hundreds of buildings, killing thousands of people in an instant. The dragon lords who were still in the city tried to reach their dragons. If they could get airborne, they might escape. They might survive. But the dragon caves were chaos. The handlers were dead or fleeing. The chains that held the more dangerous beasts had broken. Dragons were fighting each other, fighting their riders, fighting to escape the enclosed spaces that had suddenly become death traps. Lord Balix of House Gaheris made it to his dragon, a massive red beast named Vogar. He was climbing onto her back when another tremor hit. Vagar, already terrified, threw him off. He hit the stone floor hard enough to break his back. He lay there paralyzed and watched his own dragon tear the head off another dragon before smashing through the cave wall and flying away without him. Some dragons did escape with their riders. Perhaps a dozen managed to get airborne before the worst of it hit. They flew desperately toward the sea, toward the west, toward anywhere that wasn't Valyria. Most of them wouldn't make it, because now the real horror began. The lava came in waves, not flowing slowly like in a normal eruption. This was different. This was pressurized, explosive, moving with the speed of a cavalry charge. Rivers of molten rock poured down from the mountains, following the old mine shafts, the aqueducts, the streets themselves. Anything they touched simply ceased to exist. A section of the city near the eastern walls was engulfed in less than a minute. Thousands of people, dozens of buildings, entire neighborhoods, gone, turned to ash and vapor. The lava didn't leave ruins, it left nothing at all. The sea began to boil. The harbour where merchant ships had docked for millennia started bubbling and steaming. The water temperature rose so fast that fish were cooked alive. Ships caught fire from the heat alone before the flames even reached them. Sailors jumped overboard and were boiled like lobsters in a pot. One ship, a fast merchant vessel that had been preparing to leave for Volantis, managed to cut its mooring lines and push away from the dock. The captain, a man named Varro, who had sailed these waters for 30 years, ordered full sail. He didn't care which direction. He just needed to get away from the harbour, away from the boiling water, away from the death. His ship was one of the lucky ones. It escaped the harbour just before a tsunami of superheated steam rolled across the docks, killing everyone who remained. But Varro's troubles were far from over. Behind him, Valyria was burning. Ahead of him, the sea itself was becoming impossible to navigate. Great columns of steam rose hundreds of feet into the air. Whirlpools formed and disappeared. The water churned with currents that shouldn't exist. And then the earthquakes truly began. Not tremors anymore. Earthquakes. Massive ones. The kind that reshape geography. The Valyrian peninsula, which had stood unchanged for as long as men could remember, started to break apart. Fissures opened in the earth, miles long and impossibly deep. Entire sections of land simply dropped away, sliding into the sea or into magma chambers below. The eastern quarter of the city, the industrial district where the forges had been, where the great smiths had crafted Valyrian steel, it just vanished, fell into the earth, and was swallowed. The bridges that had spanned the canals, those impossible structures held up by magic and engineering, snapped like dry twigs. The hanging gardens crashed to the ground. The great towers, which had been built to withstand anything, crumbled. Some fell straight down, others toppled sideways, destroying more buildings as they fell. Scholar Tyros had made it to the docks. He had his waterproof cases of books. He had gold enough to buy passage. He was looking for a ship, any ship, when the harbour exploded. He never even felt it. One moment he existed. The next moment he was simply gone, vaporized along with his precious documents, all that knowledge lost forever. High Priest Voharon stayed in his temple. He knew there was no escape. He had known since that night he stared into the flames and saw nothing. So he sat in front of the sacred fire, the fire that had burned for 2,000 years, and he prayed, not for salvation, not for survival, just for the souls of everyone who was dying, for his city, for his people, for the empire that was ending. The roof came down on him while he was praying. He died instantly, crushed beneath stones that had been shaped by his ancestors centuries ago. The sacred flame, which had never gone out, was finally extinguished, not by wind or water, by the weight of the world falling on top of it. In the dragon caves, the few handlers who survived the initial chaos tried to free as many dragons as they could, not out of duty, not for their masters, simply because it seemed wrong to leave them chained to die. Some dragons they freed immediately took flight. Others turned on their liberators and killed them. A few, the truly loyal ones, or perhaps just the most confused, stayed with the humans even as the caves began to collapse around them. One handler, a young woman named Sajera, managed to reach a clutch of dragon eggs in a far chamber. These were valuable beyond measure. The last eggs laid by some of Valyria's greatest dragons. She grabbed as many as she could carry, 3 of them, each the size of a man's head, and she ran. She made it out of the caves, made it through streets that were rivers of fire, made it to the harbour where Varro's ship was pulling away. She dove into the boiling water, swam with strength born of pure desperation, eggs clutched to her chest. Hands reached down from the ship and pulled her aboard. She was burned over most of her body. The eggs had protected her chest, but everything else was charred. She died 2 days later, infection taking her before the ship reached Volantis. But the eggs survived. 3 of the last dragon eggs of Valyria, saved by a handler who gave her life to preserve them. The sky turned black, not with night, it was still morning, but with ash. Millions of tons of ash and rock and debris thrown into the air by the exploding mountains. It blotted out the sun. Day became darker than the darkest night. The only light came from the fires below, an orange-red glow that turned everything into a hellscape. People who were still alive, still trying to escape, found themselves blinded. They stumbled through streets they had walked 1,000 times, but could no longer see. They breathed ash instead of air, and choked on it. Their lungs filled with particles of rock and glass. Some suffocated quickly. Others took longer, drowning on dry land. The few dragons who had escaped into the air found themselves in their own nightmare. The ash cloud extended for miles. They flew blindly, choking, their wings clogged with debris. Some crashed into each other. Some simply fell from the sky when their wings gave out. Others kept flying, kept fighting, driven by instinct to get away, to survive. A dragon named Balerion the Black, bonded to Lord Veromir of House Valyrian, made it further than most. He flew west, his rider clinging to his back, both of them half dead, but still moving. They flew for hours through the ash cloud before finally breaking out into clear air. Lord Veromir looked back once. From this distance, perhaps 50 miles away, he could see what had happened to his home. Where Valyria had stood, there was now a column of ash and fire that reached into the sky further than his eyes could follow. Lightning flickered inside the cloud. The sea around the peninsula was white with steam, and even from this distance, he could see that the shape of the land had changed. Pieces were missing. Entire sections of the coastline that he had known since childhood simply weren't there anymore. He turned his dragon toward Volantis and never looked back again. He and Valyrian were among the few who would survive the doom. The destruction continued for hours, days even. The mountains kept exploding, the earth kept shaking, the lava kept flowing, the sea kept boiling. And slowly, inexorably, the Valyrian peninsula began to sink. Not all at once, piece by piece. The eastern sections went first, sliding beneath the waves, then the southern coast, then the central highlands where the city had stood. The water rushed in, meeting the lava, creating explosions of steam that sent shockwaves across the narrow sea. By the time the sun set, though no one could see it through the ash, half of Valyria was underwater. The rest was either on fire or covered in lava or shattered beyond recognition. The few ships that escaped, perhaps a dozen out of hundreds that had been in harbour, limped toward the nearest colonies. They carried perhaps 1,000 survivors total. 1,000 people out of a population that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Behind them, Valyria burned, the greatest empire the world had ever known. 5,000 years of power and magic and achievement was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch and flee and pray they were far enough away to survive. The mountains screamed, the dragons screamed, the earth itself screamed. And when the screaming finally stopped, when the ash began to settle and the fires began to die, there was nothing left but silence. Valyria was gone. The freehold was gone. The dragon lords were gone. The slaves were gone. The sorcerers, the scholars, the merchants, the artists, all gone. The buildings, the bridges, the forges, the temples, all gone. 5,000 years of history ended in a single day. The greatest civilization that ever existed, reduced to memory and ash. The sun rose the next morning on a world that had changed forever. Where Valyria had stood, there was now only smoke and ruins and poisoned water. The smoking sea, they would call it. A place where no ship could sail, where the water itself was death, where the air was poison. And in the colonies, in Volantis and Lys and Myr, the survivors arrived with their tales of horror. They spoke of mountains exploding, of the sea boiling, of dragons falling from the sky, of an entire civilization wiped out in a single morning. Most people didn't believe them at first. How could such a thing be possible? Valyria had stood forever. It couldn't just be gone. But when the ships kept arriving with the same stories, when the sky stayed dark with ash for weeks afterward, when the water along the eastern coast turned strange colours and dead fish washed up by the thousands, they had to believe. Valyria was gone, and it would never return. The first ship arrived in Volantis 3 days after the doom. It limped into harbour on a broken mast, its sails scorched black, its hull cracked and taking on water. The crew, what was left of them, were barely alive. Burns covered their bodies. Ash caked their hair and clothes. Their eyes were hollow, haunted by things no human should have to witness. The harbour master, a practical man named Carvo, who had seen 30 years of ships come and go, took one look at the vessel and knew something terrible had happened. But he wasn't prepared for what the survivors told him. Captain Varro was among them, though barely. Half his face was burned away. He could speak, but his voice was a rasp, each word obviously painful. He stood on the dock, swaying, and said simply, "Valyria is gone." Carvo didn't understand. "Gone where? What do you mean?" "Gone," Varro repeated. "The mountains exploded, the city burned, the sea boiled, everything, everyone, gone." Other survivors were being helped off the ship. Most could barely walk. Several were carried. One woman, Sierra, the dragon handler who had saved the eggs, was screaming in delirium, her burns infected, her mind broken by fever and pain. She would die that evening, but not before pressing the 3 dragon eggs into the hands of a Volantis magistrate and begging him to keep them safe. Carvo sent runners immediately to the triarchs who ruled Volantis, to the temples, to the great families. Within the hour, the entire city knew something catastrophic had happened, but most people still didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Valyria destroyed? Impossible. Then the second ship arrived, and the third. And by nightfall, 7 ships had made it to Volantis, each carrying survivors with the same story. The mountains had exploded. The earth had opened up. The greatest city in the world had been consumed in a single day. And still, many people doubted. Panic, they said. Exaggeration. Perhaps there had been an earthquake, perhaps a serious one, but surely Valyria itself still stood. Surely the freehold endured. Then came the night of black snow. 3 days after the first survivors arrived, ash began to fall on Volantis. Not regular ash from a cook fire or a forge. This was different. Fine as powder, black as midnight, falling from the sky like cursed snow. It covered everything, the streets, the buildings, people's hair and clothes. It got into houses through the smallest cracks. It clogged wells and fountains. It made breathing difficult. The ash fell for 2 days. When it finally stopped, Volantis was covered in a layer of black dust several inches deep. And everyone knew, finally and completely, that the survivors had been telling the truth. This ash had come from hundreds of miles away. It had come from mountains exploding with such force that debris had been thrown into the sky and carried on the wind across half of Essos. Valyria was truly gone. The realization hit Volantis like a physical blow. This city, the first and greatest colony, had always existed in Valyria's shadow. Every major decision was made with the freehold in mind. Every magistrate knew his power came from Valyrian approval. The entire economy was built around trade with the homeland. And now that homeland was gone, Volantis was alone. Suddenly, terrifyingly alone. The triarchs called an emergency session. They needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. They needed to make decisions. But first, they needed information. They brought in every survivor who could speak. Captain Varro, despite his injuries, was questioned for hours. So were his crew. So were the survivors from the other ships. Each told their story, and each story was horror piled upon horror. One sailor described watching the mountains explode, one after another, like a chain of fire reaching across the horizon. Another told of swimming through water so hot it boiled the skin off his arms. A merchant's wife spoke of watching her husband incinerated by a blast of heat that left nothing but ash where he had stood. A slave, freed by the chaos, described the mines erupting from below, columns of lava shooting up like geysers. But the most chilling testimony came from a Valyrian dragonlord who had survived, Lord Varamir of House Valerion, who had escaped on his dragon Balerion. He had flown over the destruction. He had seen it from above. And what he described made even the hardened magistrates of Volantis go pale. "Half the peninsula is gone," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Shock had taken him somewhere beyond grief. Simply gone, sunk beneath the sea or covered in lava. The rest is burning. The mountains are still erupting. The water is poison. Nothing lives there now. Nothing can live there. He paused, staring at something only he could see. "I flew over where the city stood, where my family's estates had been. There was nothing, just smoke and fire and ash. The towers that had stood for thousands of years, gone. The bridges, gone. The dragon caves, collapsed or flooded or burning. All of it, gone." One of the Triarchs asked the question everyone was thinking. "How many survived?" Varamir laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. Thousands died in the first minute, tens of thousands in the first hour. By the end of the day, everyone who hadn't escaped was dead. And most of those who did escape, he gestured at the survivors around him, most died on the way. Their burns were too severe. The ash in their lungs killed them, or they simply gave up, threw themselves into the sea rather than face what they had lost. "How many survived?" the Triarch asked again. "I don't know," Varamir said. 1,000, 2,000, out of a city of hundreds of thousands. And most of those survivors are here, in Volantis. The rest scattered to Lys or Maya, or wherever their ships could reach. The room went silent. 1,000 survivors. That was all that remained of the Valyrian freehold. An empire that had ruled half the world for 5,000 years, reduced to a few shipwrecked refugees. The political implications were immediate and terrifying. Volantis had always been subservient to Valyria. But Valyria no longer existed, which meant Volantis was now the greatest power in the region. Except they weren't prepared for that. They didn't have the military strength. They didn't have the dragons. They didn't have the knowledge, or the magic, or the resources that the freehold had commanded. What they did have was thousands of panicking citizens, food shortages from disrupted trade routes, and the certain knowledge that every other free city was thinking exactly the same thing. With Valyria gone, who would rule now? In Lys, survivors had also arrived. Fewer than in Volantis, perhaps a few hundred, but their stories were the same. The magistrates there faced the same sudden realization that the world had changed, and they needed to adapt quickly or be consumed by the chaos. Lys had always been the pleasure city, famous for its pillow houses and its beautiful slaves. It had never been a military power. It had never needed to be, protected as it was by Valyrian might. But now that protection was gone, and Lys was vulnerable, the magistrates immediately began fortifying the city. They conscripted every able-bodied man. They sent out ships to hire mercenary companies. They reached out to Volantis, proposing an alliance. Because if the free cities didn't work together, they would be picked apart by their enemies one by one. In Mir, the response was different. The magistrates there saw opportunity. With Valyria gone, the monopoly on advanced metalworking was broken. Mir had always been known for its craftsmen, but they had never been able to compete with Valyrian steel. Now they could. They began recruiting every smith and sorcerer who had escaped the doom. offering gold and citizenship and whatever else it took to bring those skills to Mir. 3 smiths who had worked in the Valyrian forges made it to Mir. They didn't know the full secret of Valyrian steel. That knowledge died with the master smiths, but they knew parts of it. Enough that Mir's artisans could begin experimenting, trying to recreate what had been lost. They never succeeded in making true Valyrian steel. No one ever would. But they came close enough that Myrish steel became the next best thing, sought after across the known world. The city would grow rich on metalwork and lenses and other crafts, building a new economy on the ashes of the old empire. In Tyrosh, chaos reigned. The city had been more dependent on Valyria than most, with fewer resources of its own. When the survivors arrived with news of the doom, riots broke out. The magistrates lost control. For 3 days, Tyrosh tore itself apart as different factions fought for power. Eventually, a coalition of merchant princes took control and restored order. But the damage was done. Tyrosh would spend the next decade rebuilding, and it would never quite recover its former glory. Across the narrow sea in Westeros, the news arrived more slowly. Dragonstone had known immediately. The Targaryens had watched the distant red glow on the eastern horizon and known what it meant. But the mainland of Westeros, with no direct contact to Valyria, only heard through traders and sailors weeks after the fact. In the free cities, the survivors tried to rebuild their lives. But it wasn't easy. Most had lost everything. Their homes, their families, their entire world. Many fell into despair. Some took their own lives. Others drank themselves to death or wasted away from their injuries. But some survived. Some adapted. Some found reasons to keep living. Captain Varro recovered from his burns, though his face would never heal completely. He went back to sailing, but he never went east again, never came within 100 miles of where Valyria had stood. The trauma was too deep. Lord Varamir stayed in Volantis for a year, trying to make sense of what had happened. His dragon Balerion was the last great dragon of Valyria that wasn't under Targaryen control. People whispered that he should use it to conquer, to build a new empire. But Varamir had no interest in empire. He had seen what happened to empires. Eventually, he flew north to Dragonstone and offered his service to the Targaryens, the last family of dragon lords. They accepted, and Balerion would eventually become the Mount of Aegon the Conqueror. The 3 dragon eggs that Saera had saved were kept in Volantis for several years. The magistrates who had them didn't know what to do with them. Dragon eggs were valuable, but they were also dangerous. They represented power that no one quite knew how to use. Eventually, they were traded to a merchant lord from Pentos in exchange for food shipments during a famine. The eggs changed hands several more times over the decades. One was lost. One hatched, but the dragon died young. The third survived, and its bloodline would continue, contributing to the small resurgence of dragons in Essos before they faded again. In the weeks and months after the doom, ships continued to find survivors. Not many. A handful of slaves who had stolen boats and somehow navigated to safety. A few merchants who had been travelling when the doom struck and only heard about it later. A scholar who had been studying in Volantis and suddenly realized his entire family was gone. Each survivor carried pieces of Valyria with them, memories, knowledge, skills, objects they had managed to save. A smith brought tools. A scholar brought books. A noblewoman brought a necklace of Valyrian steel links that had been in her family for generations. These fragments were all that remained of 5,000 years of civilization, and the survivors clung to them desperately because they were all that was left of home. Some survivors tried to preserve Valyrian culture. They taught their children the old language. They maintained the old customs. They told stories of how magnificent Valyria had been, how beautiful, how powerful. But with each generation, those memories faded. The children born after the Doom never saw Valyria. To them, it was just stories, legends. Their parents spoke of a golden age, but the children lived in a world where Valyria was just ruins and smoke. A few brave souls, or perhaps just foolish ones, tried to return to Valyria. Treasure hunters mostly, lured by tales of gold and Valyrian steel lying unclaimed in the ruins. Ships would set out, full of hope and greed, planning to salvage what they could from the greatest city ever built. None of those ships returned. Not one. The Smoking Sea, as it came to be called, was death. The water was poisoned. The air was poison. Demons lived there, or so people said. Stone men, afflicted with grayscale, haunted the ruins. And the ruins themselves were unstable, liable to collapse or sink without warning. The few reports that filtered back, usually from ships that turned back before reaching Valyria proper, spoke of horrors. Watchers on distant shores claimed to see lights moving in the ruins at night. Others spoke of sounds, terrible sounds, echoing across the water. Some claimed dragons still lived there, mad and feral, breathing fire at anything that moved. Most likely, these were just stories. The trauma of the Doom gave birth to 1,000 legends. But the fact remained that the Smoking Sea was deadly. Ships that ventured too close never came back. And so Valyria, or what was left of it, was left alone. A tomb for an empire. A warning to the world. In Volantis, a group of scholars began compiling everything they knew about Valyria. They interviewed survivors. They gathered texts that had been copied from Valyrian originals. They tried to preserve as much knowledge as possible before the last generation who had actually seen Valyria died. Their work would form the basis of what the world would remember about the Freehold. Incomplete, inaccurate in places, filtered through trauma and loss and the limits of memory. But it was something. A record, a testament, proof that Valyria had existed and that it had been great. Years passed, then decades. The survivors aged. The children who had fled Valyria as infants grew into adults who barely remembered their homeland. The generation born after the Doom knew Valyria only through stories. And slowly, the world adapted. The free cities found their footing. They established new trade routes that didn't depend on Valyria. They developed their own industries. They learned to exist without the empire that had dominated their entire existence. But they never forgot. Even centuries later, before the Doom, would be a phrase that carried weight. A reference to a better time. A golden age that was lost forever. The survivors passed on their stories, of towers that touched the sky, of dragons filling the air, of magic that could reshape the world, of wealth beyond imagining, of beauty and power and glory, and they passed on their warning. That power has a price, that empires fall, that nothing, no matter how great, lasts forever, that the earth itself can rise up and destroy what men build. Valyria was gone, but its shadow would stretch across the world for centuries to come. In the Valyrian steel swords that became priceless heirlooms, in the high Valyrian language that scholars still studied, in the ruins that no one dared approach, in the dreams of the ambitious who wanted to rebuild what had been lost. And in one place, more than anywhere else, the shadow of Valyria lived on. On a distant island fortress called Dragonstone, where one family of survivors watched and waited and planned, the Targaryens, the last dragon lords, the last keepers of Valyrian power, they remembered, they preserved, and they prepared, because one day they would build a new empire, not in Valyria, not in Essos, but in Westeros, on land their ancestors had never conquered. The doom had ended one world, but it had created the conditions for a new one, a world where the Targaryens, minor and unimportant in old Valyria, would become the most powerful family alive. The ashes of the old empire would nourish the roots of the new one, and fire and blood would forge a new age from the ruins of the old. On Dragonstone, 1,200 miles from Valyria, the Targaryens saw the end of their world. It was Daenerys who noticed it first. She had barely slept since their arrival on the island 5 days earlier. Every night the dreams came, fire and destruction and screaming. Sometimes she saw it clearly, the mountains exploding, the city burning, the sea consuming everything. Other times it was just feelings, terror, loss, the end of everything she had ever known. On the morning of the doom, she woke before dawn. Something had pulled her from sleep, some instinct she didn't fully understand. She went to the eastern battlements of Dragonstone, the ones that faced toward Valyria across hundreds of miles of sea, and she waited. Her father, Lord Enar Targaryen, found her there an hour later. He didn't ask why she was awake. He didn't ask what she was waiting for. He had learned to trust his daughter's instincts. If she needed to be here, watching the eastern horizon, then this was where she needed to be. They stood together in silence as the sun rose, a normal sunrise, beautiful. The sky turned from black to grey to pink to gold. Seabirds called, waves crashed against the rocks below. It was peaceful, almost perfect. Then, as the sun fully cleared the horizon, Daenerys pointed. There. On the eastern horizon, barely visible at this distance, a red glow had appeared. Not the red of sunrise. This was different. Darker, angrier, like the sky itself was bleeding. Within minutes, the rest of the family had joined them. Aenar's wife, Valyrian, their sons, Aegon and Visenya, their household guards and servants. Everyone who lived on Dragonstone gathered on the battlements to watch. The red glow grew. It spread across the horizon like a stain. And then, even from 1,200 miles away, they saw it. A massive column of ash and fire, rising into the sky, growing taller and taller until it seemed to reach the heavens themselves. No one spoke. What was there to say? They were watching their homeland die. Everything they had known, everyone they had left behind, was being consumed in that distant fire. The column of ash rose for hours. By midday, it had spread across half the sky. By evening, the sun was hidden behind a haze of debris that had travelled hundreds of miles on the wind. The light turned strange, filtered through ash, giving everything a sickly orange tint. That night, Dragonstone's 5 dragons were restless. They paced in their lairs. They called out to each other, their cries echoing off the volcanic stone of the fortress. They knew. Even at this distance, they could sense what had happened. Their ancestral home was gone, and they mourned in the only way dragons knew how, with fire and rage and grief. Daenerys stood on the battlements again that night, watching the red glow that still marked where Valyria had been. Her father joined her. You saved us, Enar said quietly. Your dreams, your warnings. If we had stayed, we would be dead, Daenerys finished. Her voice was flat, empty. Everyone we knew is dead. The Balerions, the Valyrians who stayed behind, the Coheres, all 40 families of the Freehold, dead. An entire civilization, gone. Enar had no words to comfort her. How could he? She was right. Their friends were dead. Their extended family was dead. The world they'd grown up in had ceased to exist. We survived, he said finally. That matters. Does it? Daenerys turned to look at him. Her eyes were haunted. I saw it coming. I warned them, the council, the other families, the priests. I told them all. And they didn't believe me. They thought I was mad. They mocked us for leaving. They were fools. They were our people, Daenerys said. And now they're gone. And we're here, alive, safe, while they... She couldn't finish. She turned back to the eastern horizon, to the red glow that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. Over the next few days, ash began to fall on Dragonstone. Not as much as had fallen on Volantis. The island was farther away, but enough to cover everything in a fine grey dust. Enough to remind them, every moment of every day, that their world had ended. Ships began arriving from the free cities, bringing news and survivors. The Targaryens learned the full scope of what had happened. The mountains exploding, the peninsula sinking, the thousands dead, the handful who had escaped. Lord Veromir arrived on his dragon Valyrian, seeking refuge. He brought with him the most detailed account of the doom anyone had heard. He described flying over the ruins, seeing the destruction from above. He wept as he told it, this proud dragon lord reduced to tears by what he had witnessed. The Targaryens took him in, fed him, gave him a place to stay. Because that's what you did for survivors. You helped them. You gave them shelter. You reminded them that they weren't alone. But with each survivor who arrived, with each new story of horror and loss, the reality became clearer. The Targaryens weren't just survivors. They were the last dragon lords, the only major family to escape intact, the sole keepers of Valyrian power in a world that had suddenly become very different. Enar called a family council, his wife, his children, a few trusted advisors. They gathered in the great hall of Dragonstone, beneath the carved dragons that decorated the walls, and they discussed what came next. We could return to Essos, Valyrian said. Establish ourselves in Volantis. We have dragons. We have knowledge. We could help rebuild. Rebuild what? Aegon, their eldest son, shook his head. Mother, Valyria is gone. There's nothing to rebuild. And Volantis, they'll see us as a threat. 5 dragons. That's more military power than any of the free cities can match. They'll either try to control us or eliminate us. Then what do you suggest? Valyria asked. Aegon looked at his father. We stay here. We build our strength, and we look west. Everyone knew what he meant. Westeros, the unconquered land, 7 kingdoms that had never fallen to Valyrian might. Not because they were particularly strong, but because Valyria had never bothered to invade. There were no precious metals there, no valuable trade goods, just castles and farms and forests, not worth the effort. But now the calculation had changed. The Targaryens were no longer a minor family in a vast empire. They were a major power, perhaps the major power in a suddenly much smaller world. And Westeros, unconquered Westeros, represented opportunity. Not now, Einar said. We're not ready. We need time. Time to grow our strength. Time to breed more dragons. Time to plan. How much time? Aegon pressed. Einar looked at his son. Aegon was young, barely 20, but already showing the ambition that would one day make him a conqueror. Generations, perhaps. This isn't something we can rush. But yes, I think you're right. Our future lies in Westeros, not Essos. The decision was made. The Targaryens would remain on Dragonstone. They would maintain diplomatic contact with the free cities, but keep their distance. They would focus on their dragons, breeding them, training them, increasing their numbers. And they would study Westeros, learn its kingdoms, understand its weaknesses. One day, when the time was right, they would cross the narrow sea. But not yet. Not for years. Maybe not for generations. Danis said little during this council. She sat quietly, listening, her mind elsewhere. She had saved her family, but she hadn't saved Valyria. That guilt would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would have more dreams over the years, glimpses of possible futures, warnings of dangers to come. But none would ever be as clear or as terrible as the dreams that had shown her the doom. In the weeks and months after the catastrophe, Dragonstone became a refuge for survivors. Not many. The island was remote and not well known outside of Valyrian circles, but a few dozen managed to find their way there. Sailors who had been at sea when the doom struck. Merchants who had been travelling. A handful of lesser nobles from families that had maintained estates in the colonies. The Targaryens took them all in, fed them, sheltered them, listened to their stories. Because these people were precious. They were living links to Valyria. They carried knowledge, skills, memories, things that would be lost forever if they died. One survivor was particularly valuable. A scholar named Maegor, no relation to the Targaryens, who had specialized in dragon lore. He had been in Volantis studying their library when the doom struck. He brought with him scrolls and books, copies of texts that had been destroyed in Valyria. Information on dragon breeding, dragon training, dragon health. Einar gave him a position as the family's dragon master. Maegor would spend the rest of his life on Dragonstone, working with the Targaryen dragons, applying his knowledge to help the family grow their most important resource. His work would lay the foundation for the strong dragon population that would eventually allow Aegon's conquest. The Targaryens also worked to preserve other aspects of Valyrian culture. They maintained the language, teaching it to their children and grandchildren. They kept the old customs, the festivals and rituals that marked Valyrian life. They collected artifacts, anything that had survived the doom. Scrolls, weapons, art, jewelry. Building these into a collection that would help future generations remember where they came from. But they also adapted. They learned the common tongue of Westeros, because if they were going to conquer it one day, they needed to understand it. They studied the faith of the Seven and the old gods to understand what motivated the people they would one day rule. They traded with Westerosi merchants, building relationships and gathering intelligence. Dragonstone itself was transformed. Before the doom, it had been a minor outpost, a fortress at the edge of the Empire. Now it became the center of Targaryen power. The castle was expanded. The dragon lairs were improved. Defenses were strengthened. The island's population grew slowly. Survivors came and stayed. Children were born. Marriages were arranged. The Targaryens were careful about this, maintaining the blood purity that they believed was necessary to bond with dragons. They married within the family when needed, and when they married outside the family, they chose partners who could trace some Valyrian ancestry. Lord Valyria eventually married a Targaryen cousin and settled on Dragonstone permanently. His dragon Valyrian became part of the family's strength, one of the largest and most powerful dragons alive. The two other dragons that had escaped the doom with minor families also eventually came under Targaryen control, either through marriage alliances or simple purchase. By the time Enar died, 15 years after the doom, the Targaryens had 9 dragons. Not a huge number compared to what Valyria had commanded, but more than anyone else in the world. More than enough to conquer kingdoms if they chose to. But they didn't choose to. Not yet. Enar's son remembered his father's words. Generations. They needed generations to prepare. On Dragonstone, life developed a new rhythm. The daily work of maintaining dragons, the studies of Westeros, the careful breeding programs, the preservation of knowledge. It was a quieter life than they would have had in Valyria, less grand, less cosmopolitan. But it was purposeful. Every action was aimed toward a goal that would take a century to achieve. Danis lived on Dragonstone for another 40 years after the doom. She never married, never had children. Her dreams had left her changed, unable to connect with people the way she once had. She spent her days helping her nephews and nieces learn to ride dragons, teaching them the old stories, making sure they understood the weight of what they carried. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 62. Her last recorded words were, "I saved them. That's enough." Whether she meant her family or humanity in general, no one could say. The years passed. The memory of Valyria began to fade, but slowly. The first generation who had actually seen the freehold told their stories to the second generation. The second generation told them to the third, each telling lost details, added embellishments, transformed history into legend. By the time Aegon the Conqueror was born, a century after the doom, Valyria was already becoming mythical. A golden age that had existed once and would never exist again. The greatest empire the world had ever known, destroyed in a single day by forces beyond human control. Aegon grew up hearing these stories. He learned to read High Valyrian from scrolls salvaged from the ruins. He studied the maps that showed where Valyria had been, the vast territories it had controlled. He trained with the dragons that were Valyria's greatest legacy. And he looked west, toward Westeros, and he understood what his family had been preparing for all these years. Valyria was gone, but its power could be reborn. Not in Essos, where the free cities squabbled and fought and remembered the old empire too well to accept Targaryen rule, but in Westeros, where no one had ever been conquered by dragons before. The Targaryens had been a minor family in Valyria, middling power, not particularly important. They had survived the doom, not because they were the strongest or the richest, but because they had been willing to listen to a girl's dreams, because they had been willing to walk away from power and prestige to save their lives. That decision, that willingness to abandon everything, had made them the most powerful family in the world, the only family with dragons, the last dragon lords, the sole inheritors of Valyrian might. From the battlements of Dragonstone, you could see Westeros on a clear day, a distant line of coast, barely visible on the horizon. 7 kingdoms that had existed for thousands of years, separate and divided. 7 kingdoms that had never been united. 7 kingdoms that had never faced dragons in war. Aegon would change that. One day he would fly west with his sisters and his dragons. He would bring fire and blood to Westeros. He would forge 7 kingdoms into one. He would build an empire on Valyrian principles, using Valyrian power, speaking Valyrian words. But it wouldn't be Valyria. It would be something new. Something born from ash and loss and a century of careful preparation. A Westerosi empire with a Valyrian heart. The doom had ended one age. But from the survivors, from the last dragon lords, from the family that had escaped and rebuilt and prepared, a new age would begin. On Dragonstone, the Targaryens waited. They watched. They remembered. And they planned. Because empires don't build themselves. And the next great empire wouldn't rise in Valyria's ruins. It would rise in the west, in unconquered lands, built by the last family to carry Valyria's fire. The old world was dead. The new world was waiting to be born. And when the time came, the Targaryens would be ready. 100 years after the doom, a Volantin merchant captain named Orion decided he had heard enough legends about treasure in the ruins. He was a practical man, not given to superstition. The stories about demons and curses and poison water, these were just stories, he told himself. Tales meant to keep competitors away from the greatest hoard of wealth the world had ever seen. Valyria had been the richest city in history. Its ruins must be filled with gold, with Valyrian steel, with dragon eggs, with treasures beyond counting. Orion gathered a crew. Not easy, given where he wanted to sail, but gold talks, and he had enough of it to convince desperate men to take the risk. He bought a sturdy ship, stocked it with supplies, and set sail for the smoking sea. His ship never returned. No wreckage was ever found. No survivors ever washed ashore with tales of what they had seen. Orion and his crew simply vanished, as completely as if they had never existed. He was not the first to try. He would not be the last. Every few years, someone would convince themselves that they could succeed where others had failed. They would sail into the smoking sea with dreams of wealth and power. And they would disappear. The smoking sea earned its name. The water there was never quite the right colour. Sometimes it was murky grey. Sometimes it had an oily sheen. Sometimes it seemed to steam even on cold days. Ships that ventured too close reported that the water was warm to the touch, unnaturally so, as if the ocean itself had a fever. The air was worse. Sailors who got close enough described a smell like rotten eggs mixed with burning metal. They described feeling dizzy, nauseous, confused. Some reported seeing things that couldn't be there, lights moving in the ruins, shapes that might have been men or might have been something else, sounds that echoed across the water with no visible source. Those who turned back in time survived, though many suffered illness for weeks afterward. Those who pressed on were never seen again. The ruins themselves, visible from a distance on clear days, looked wrong. Buildings that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Towers that stood at impossible angles. Stone that appeared to be melting, flowing like candle wax. Whether this was real or some trick of the poisoned air, no one could say. The maesters of the citadel studied the doom as best they could from a distance. They collected reports from sailors. They interviewed survivors and their descendants. They tried to understand what exactly had happened that day, and why the ruins remained so dangerous a century later. Their theories varied. Some believed the volcanic eruptions had released toxic gases that still lingered in the area, poisoning the air and water. Others thought the Valyrians' extensive use of magic had somehow corrupted the land itself, creating a wound in the world that would never heal. A few suggested that the Valyrians had been experimenting with forces they didn't fully understand, and the doom was the result of those experiments going catastrophically wrong. One maester, Theron, spent 30 years collecting every scrap of information about the doom he could find. He interviewed hundreds of people, survivors who were still alive, children of survivors, sailors who had been near the smoking sea, merchants who traded with the free cities. He compiled his findings into a massive tome called The Fall of Valyria, a Historical Analysis. In it, he concluded that the doom was not a natural disaster. The timing was too precise, the destruction too complete. 14 volcanoes erupting simultaneously. Impossible, unless something had triggered them all at once. He suggested that the Valyrians, in their endless quest for more power, more magic, more control over the natural world, had pushed too far. They had disturbed something deep in the earth, something that had been sleeping, and it had awakened with catastrophic results. His book was controversial. Many scholars dismissed it as speculation, but it remained the most comprehensive study of the doom for generations, and parts of it were undoubtedly true. The Valyrians had been experimenting constantly. They had been mining deeper and deeper into the earth. They had been using magic in ways that no one fully understood. Whether they had caused their own destruction or simply been victims of terrible timing, the result was the same. The greatest empire the world had ever known was gone, and what remained was deadly enough that even a century later, no one could safely approach it. The free cities had adapted to the post-doom world, but none of them had truly thrived. Volantis liked to think of itself as Valyria's heir, but it was a pale shadow of what the freehold had been. It had the Black Walls, the section of the city where only those of Valyrian blood could live, but even that was a reminder of loss. These were people desperately clinging to an identity that was no longer relevant. The Volantin Triarchs still dreamed of reuniting the free cities under their rule, of rebuilding something that resembled the old empire. But the other cities, Lys, Myr, Tyrosh, Pentos, Bravos, they had no interest in being ruled. They had tasted independence. They had built their own economies, their own cultures. They fought wars with each other constantly, shifting alliances, temporary truces, endless conflicts over trade routes and territory. These wars never produced a clear winner. No single city could dominate the others. They were roughly equal in power, and any city that started to pull ahead would immediately face a coalition of its rivals. So they fought and fought and fought, bleeding each other's resources, achieving nothing except mutual exhaustion. It was a far cry from the Pax Valyria, the 5,000 years of relative peace enforced by dragonlords who had the power to burn any rebellion before it could start. The free cities remembered that peace. They even missed it, in a way. But none of them was willing to submit to another city's authority to achieve it. Valyrian steel became the most precious commodity in the world. The Valyrians had produced it in abundance, and many noble families had owned swords or armor made from it. But after the doom, no new Valyrian steel could be made. The secrets had died with the smiths who knew them. The existing swords became heirlooms, passed down through families, worth more than castles. A man with a Valyrian steel sword was marked as nobility, as someone whose family had history, importance, wealth. These weapons were given names, histories, legends. They became symbols of power in ways they never had been when they were merely expensive tools. Blacksmiths across the world tried to recreate Valyrian steel. The maesters tried. The sorcerers of Korth tried. The smiths of Hohor, who came closest to understanding the process, could reforge existing Valyrian steel, but not create new. Every attempt to forge steel from scratch, to recreate what the Valyrians had done, failed. The secret was gone, lost in the ruins of the smoking sea, buried under lava or sunk beneath poisoned water. Perhaps it still existed, written in scrolls that lay in some collapsed library, but no one could reach them. No one could survive long enough in the ruins to search. The dragons fared little better. After the Doom, only the Targaryens had a sustainable dragon population. A few other dragons survived in Essos. Wild creatures descended from beasts that had escaped their masters, but they were rare and dangerous. People occasionally reported seeing them in the wilderness east of Slava's Bay, or in the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. But these weren't the magnificent trained dragons of Valyria. These were animals reverting to their wild state, becoming legends and nightmares rather than tools of power. And they were dying out. Each generation produced fewer eggs. The dragons were fading from the world, as if the Doom had broken something essential in their nature. Only on Dragonstone did dragons truly flourish. The Targaryens bred them carefully, maintained them, studied them, using knowledge salvaged from Valyria. By the time Aegon the Conqueror was ruled to invade Westeros, his family had 13 dragons. Not many by Valyrian standards, but more than anyone else in the world. The High Valyrian language survived, but barely. The free cities each developed their own dialects, bastardized versions that borrowed from local languages and evolved in different directions. True High Valyrian, the language of the Dragon Lords, was maintained only by scholars and by the Targaryens. It became a language of prestige, of education. Wealthy families hired tutors to teach their children High Valyrian, even though they would never use it in daily life. It was a mark of culture, of civilization, of connection to the lost Golden Age. Speaking High Valyrian meant you were educated. It meant your family had history. It meant you remembered Valyria, even if you had never seen it. The maesters preserved High Valyrian texts in their libraries. Religious orders maintained scrolls in the old language. Merchants used it occasionally for contracts, since it was considered the language of binding oaths. But as a living language, as something people actually spoke in their daily lives, it was dying. Another casualty of the Doom, fading slowly rather than being destroyed all at once. The political consequences of the Doom reshaped the world. Before, Valyria had been the unquestioned dominant power in Essos. After, there was a vacuum, a massive vacuum that various powers tried to fill. The Dothraki, nomadic horse lords from the eastern grasslands, expanded aggressively into territories that Valyria had once controlled. Without dragons to stop them, they raided and conquered and built their own empire of grass and horses. The Dothraki Khalasars became the terror of Essos, and the free cities had to pay them tribute or face destruction. In the Far East, Korth grew in power as the main trade hub between Essos and Yiti. They controlled the Jade Gates, and they used that position to become wealthy beyond measure. The Qartheen built palaces that rivaled anything in the free cities, though their power was commercial rather than military. The Giscari cities, Meereen, Yunkai, Astapor, rebuilt themselves on the foundation of slavery. Without Valyrian competition, they became the primary slave markets of the known world. They bred slave soldiers, the unsullied, trained from childhood to be perfect warriors. They traded in human flesh and grew rich from it. In Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms remained separate and constantly warring. The Reach fought the Stormlands, the Ironborn raided everyone, the North kept to itself. Dorne maintained its independence through guerrilla warfare. The Riverlands were conquered by whoever was strongest at any given moment. But they all watched Dragonstone. They all knew that the Targaryens were there, growing stronger, breeding dragons. Some Westerosi lords dismissed the threat. Dragons had never conquered Westeros before. Why would they now? But the wiser lords, the ones who studied history, knew better. Dragons had never conquered Westeros because Valyria had never bothered to try. The freehold had seen no profit in it. But the Targaryens were different. They were exiles, survivors, the last of their kind. They had nowhere else to go. And they had dragons. When Aegon finally came, landing at the future site of King's Landing with his sister wives and his 3 dragons, the conquest was almost inevitable. The Westerosi kingdoms couldn't unite against him. They tried, but old hatreds ran too deep, and against Dragonfire their armies burned. Aegon built his new empire using Valyrian methods. He claimed legitimacy through conquest, just as the Valyrians had. He maintained control through the threat of Dragonfire. He even built his capital in the Valyrian style, with a red keep that echoed the architecture of the freehold. But it wasn't Valyria. It couldn't be. Aegon ruled a single continent, not half the known world. He had 3 dragons, not hundreds. He spoke to his subjects in the common tongue, not High Valyrian. His throne was made of conquered swords, a symbol of unity through force, not the ancient authority of 5,000 years of civilization. The Targaryen dynasty would last for 300 years, a respectable run by Westerosi standards, but a fraction of what Valyria had achieved. And even during those 3 centuries, the dragons dwindled. The last dragon died small and twisted during the reign of Aegon III, a sad little creature, nothing like the magnificent beasts that had conquered the 7 kingdoms. Without dragons, the Targaryens were just another dynasty. Special, perhaps, with their silver hair and purple eyes marking them as different, but vulnerable. Subject to the same forces of rebellion and decay that affected every royal house. Eventually, they would fall, overthrown by Robert Baratheon in a rebellion that would have been impossible if they still had dragons. The doom's consequences rippled forward through centuries. It had destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever known. It had created a power vacuum that was never truly filled. It had scattered knowledge and magic and dragons until they nearly disappeared. It had transformed the political landscape of 2 continents. And it had left behind ruins that, hundreds of years later, still killed anyone who tried to explore them. The smoking sea remained deadly. The ruins remained forbidden. Valyria remained a tomb, a warning, a reminder of how completely great civilizations can fall. Stone men, afflicted with grayscale in its most virulent form, made their homes in the ruins. These were people who had been exiled from civilized lands, sent to die slowly in the poisoned remains of Valyria. They lived in the fallen towers, hunted in the twisted streets, died in the toxic waters, and they attacked anyone foolish enough to come near, spreading their disease, increasing their numbers. Some claimed these stone men were cursed by the doom itself, that the sorcery that had destroyed Valyria still lingered, corrupting anyone who stayed too long in the ruins. Others said grayscale had always existed, and the stone men simply congregated in Valyria because they had nowhere else to go. Either way, they made the ruins even more dangerous. Even if you could survive the poison water and toxic air, even if you could navigate the unstable structures and avoid the areas that still glowed with heat, you still had to face the stone men. And grayscale was a death sentence, slow and terrible. The doom became a metaphor. When people wanted to speak of total destruction, of civilization's fragility, of pride leading to fall, they spoke of Valyria. The phrase, "pride comes before the doom," entered common language. Ambitious lords were warned not to fly too close to the 14 flames. Scholars debated what lessons should be learned. Some argued it showed the danger of relying too heavily on magic, of trying to control forces beyond human understanding. Others said it demonstrated the risks of slavery, that the Valyrians' cruel treatment of millions had somehow brought cosmic justice down on them. Still, others claimed it was simply bad luck, a natural disaster that could have happened to any civilization built on volcanic lands. But perhaps the truest lesson was simpler. Nothing lasts forever. Valyria had stood for 5,000 years. 5,000 years of dominance, of power, of certainty that they would rule forever. And then, in a single day, it was gone. All that power, all that knowledge, all that history reduced to smoking ruins and poisoned water. The Meisters who studied the doom found themselves drawn to one particular detail. In the final days before the catastrophe, there had been warnings, the tremors, the restless dragons, the contradictory prophecies, the fireworms rising, the scholars like Tyros who documented everything, the priests who tried to sound the alarm. The warnings were there. The Valyrians had simply chosen not to listen. They had been so confident in their power, so certain of their ability to control the world around them, that they couldn't imagine anything could threaten them. And that certainty had killed them. It was a lesson that resonated through the ages. How many other civilizations were ignoring warnings, assuming their own invincibility? How many other empires were building on unstable foundations, certain that their power made them immune to consequences? In the libraries of the Citadel, young Meisters studied the doom as part of their education. They learned the facts, the dates, the locations, the immediate consequences. But they also learned the deeper lesson, that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that power without humility leads to disaster, that no matter how great you become, the world can still break you. Daenerys Targaryen, born nearly 400 years after the doom, would hatch 3 dragon eggs in the Red Waste and bring dragons back to a world that had forgotten them. She would speak High Valyrian, command armies, conquer cities, and dream of breaking the wheel of power that crushed the innocent. She carried Valyria's blood. She rode Valyria's dragons. She spoke Valyria's language. But she had never seen Valyria, and she never would. To her, as to everyone in her generation, Valyria was myth and legend, a cautionary tale, a lost golden age that could never be recovered. The Doom had made sure of that. By destroying Valyria so completely, by making the ruins so deadly that no one could explore them, it had ensured that the freehold would never return. There could be no restoration, no rebuilding, no second Valyrian Empire. Only memory and legend and ruins that killed anyone who tried to reclaim them. And perhaps that was fitting. Valyria had been built on the suffering of millions, the slaves who died in the mines, the conquered peoples ground under Valyrian boots, the civilizations destroyed by dragon fire. For 5,000 years, Valyria had prospered through cruelty and power and the certainty that they deserved to rule. Maybe the Doom was the world balancing the scales. Maybe it was cosmic justice. Or maybe it was just geology and bad luck, and a civilization built on top of volcanoes, finally facing the inevitable consequences. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Valyria was gone. Its empire was scattered. Its knowledge was lost. Its dragons nearly extinct. Its language dying. Its steel irreplaceable. Its ruins forbidden. And the world moved on, as worlds do. New empires rose. New powers emerged. New conquerors tried their hand at domination. But they all knew the story of Valyria. They all understood the lesson. No matter how powerful you become, no matter how long you last, no matter how certain you are of your place in the world, eventually the earth can open beneath your feet and swallow everything you've built. The Doom of Valyria wasn't just the end of an empire. It was a reminder that all empires end, that power is temporary, that civilizations, no matter how great, are fragile things built on foundations that can crack without warning. 5,000 years of glory, gone in a day. 100,000 people reduced to 1,000 survivors. The greatest city ever built, transformed into ruins so deadly that even centuries later they remain untouchable. That was the Doom of Valyria, and its shadow stretches across history. A warning to every civilization that thinks itself eternal. A reminder that fire can consume everything, that the earth can reclaim what humans build. That power, no matter how absolute it seems, is always one disaster away from extinction. The day fire ate an empire, it changed the world forever. And the world has never forgotten, can never forget, what happened when Valyria fell. If you found this journey through the Doom compelling, if walking through the last days of the greatest empire ever known has left you thinking about power and pride and the price of both, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think really caused the Doom? Could the Valyrians have prevented it if they'd heeded the warnings? And what other dark corners of Westeros and Essos should we explore together? If you want more deep dives into the histories and mysteries of A Song of Ice and Fire, you know what to do. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the secrets buried in the ashes of the past. Because in this world of ice and fire, every story matters, every choice has consequences, and every empire, no matter how mighty, is just one bad day away from becoming legend.